Thanks, Stuart. Thank you also to Sonia and Nasser and the organisers. What a privilege it is for me finally to meet Ali Abunimah. I thought I would not have that chance for a perilous few days, and that indeed is going to be one of the themes of my remarks. I generally introduce myself, so it's a very great honour for me to be introduced by Stuart, but when I introduce myself, I say this. I say, my name is Jake Lynch, and I am still the Director of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. Now, we have heard some very interesting remarks today about truth-telling, about facts, and about the need to distinguish between facts and claims in the production of social meaning, and the political implications of some of those distinctions. And of course, they are also distinctions that are, or at least should be, salient in the academic world. Academic endeavour, academic research is supposed to proceed on the basis of evidence, and the evidence should be assembled from as broad a range of sources as possible. It's a sphere in which we should still observe the spirit, at least, of the famous remarks by John Stuart Mill in his classic Defence of Liberalism on liberty, about the evils of silencing an opinion, depriving us all of the opportunity to exchange truth for error. So this is really what lies behind the principle of intellectual freedom in our universities. The fact is that we are all employed with obligation and that responsibility by conducting our research without fear or favour. And we should therefore be able to present it to the public as the product of a process in which we have consulted every possible point of view, every possible version of events, every possible perspective in conditions of complete freedom. Only then can our findings be regarded as truly reliable, and only if they are reliable do they represent value for money. So this is the principle of intellectual freedom. And it's an animating spirit of the university. And when I say the university, I mean the community of scholars, both staff and students, who are engaged on this process of free inquiry. But unfortunately, in some ways, that principle has run headlong in recent years at the University of Urbana-Champaign, greatly to its discredit, very candidly over his support for the rights and freedoms of the Palestinians in the specific situation of an attack on Gaza. So I found that a mini-department just means a department that is a system of governance in which we have an elected governing council, and that council has played an active role in giving us a political voice on a range of topics, such as the militarization of Australia. And also, of course, it has made us the only part of any Australian university which supports the academic boycott of Israel. Now, various bureaucratic reasons have been put forward for this change to our status, which would strip away these layers from our centre. Various bureaucratic reasons have been put forward for it, and I'll briefly rehearse them, if only to convey to you my own opinion, which I think you will already divine, that they are rather on the flimsy side. One, for example, is that we don't fulfil the functions of a centre because we don't effectively marshal academic colleagues across boundaries of discipline and unit and school, etc., to engage with critical questions of peace and conflict, which rather conveniently overlooks our long and well-known record of doing just that. One does really wonder whether those annual reports we send to university managers ever get read. The second one is that demand has declined. Demand has declined for peace and conflict studies. Well, it's no secret that in our centre, as in much of Australian higher education, there was a giant sucking sound a few years back in 2011 when the dollar zoomed up in value, and that giant sucking sound was of students being put off from coming to Australia because it would suddenly cost them 50% more. Quelle surprise, you may say. But since then, over the ensuing 4 years, demand and enrolments in our centre have held steady within quite a narrow band. So this is presented, including by university spokespersons to the media, as evidence of decline. Well, only in a faculty of arts could an analysis of that level of innumeracy be put forward and taken seriously. It's rather reminiscent, it's as misleading, and in the same way as the infamous testimony to Congress by the then Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, in which he said that there were links between the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq and Osama bin Laden, and here was the phrase, going back 10 years. Now, if I say to you, I've been interested in philately, I've been collecting stamps going back 10 years, you wouldn't assume that 10 years ago I stuck a single stamp in an album, but that was it. There was one meeting 10 years previously, and that was supposed to be going back 10 years. So that excuse, sorry, I should say rationale for downgrading our centre is rather on the flimsy side as well. What was the third one? I can't even remember the third one. But look, you know, if the stated bureaucratic reasons for this proposed unilateral change are so unconvincing, then what, I hear you cry, may really lie behind this move to downgrade the only part of any Australian university that supports the academic boycott of Israel? What a mystery. And perhaps it's a mystery that we could decode with reference to the relevant context of what have been a concerning series of free speech incidents at the university, which may belie the influence of these corporate interests on that value of intellectual freedom, which ought to be at the heart of what we do. One of them, which is near the front of our minds, concerns Ali himself, of course, who was denied a visa for a period of weeks, which would usually be granted in a few days. And at one point, a room booking for the meeting, which was going to be addressed by Ali at the University of Sydney, that room booking was revoked. And the university told the organisers, well, we've revoked the room booking because he doesn't have a visa to come to Australia. Now, that's rather on the mysterious side, and what lies unanswered at the moment is a question that was put to the university spokesperson: does the University of Sydney make a habit of checking for itself whether proposed visitors to the university have the paperwork to enter Australia before it confirms the booking for the room? Was the same procedure indeed applied to the lecturer who was due to visit the university from the United States the following week to lecture on the paintings of Tintoretto? Now, it's worth, I did hear you cry there, didn't I? It's worth noting, I think, at this stage, that very good question, which, as I say, as yet lies unanswered, was put to the university spokesperson by a reporter from The Australian. Or perhaps it should be the very similar publication, which is sometimes referred to as Even The Australian. That is to say, even The Australian is asking this question. So the episode concerning Ali was just one of them. A few years ago, before the present university administration took up office, we in CPACS staged a meeting at which we did hear from the leader of the Uyghur people of Western China, what China refers to as the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, Rabia Kadir. And when news of this proposed event reached the Chinese consulate in Sydney, they waxed wroth, as you can imagine, and contacted the Vice-Chancellor. Now, I'd invited the Vice-Chancellor to make a few well-chosen remarks at the start of a conference that we were holding, and the then Vice-Chancellor, Gavin Brown, who was an impressive personage, espied me in the tea break and said, "Ah, Lynch, yes, wanting a word." He said, "Listen, this meeting with Rabia Kadir," he said, "whatever you do, don't let the Chinese think they've got the slightest bit of influence over what you do. If you let them know that, you'll never hear from the last of them," he said. And what a healthy attitude that was. Entirely consistent with the principles of intellectual freedom. How we pine for those days. Indeed, especially how we pined for those days when a group of students invited His Holiness the Dalai Lama to speak at the university. Like Rabia Kadir, regarded as a serial irritant by the Chinese authorities, and an invitation that was extended was then revoked. And it was revoked by a group of academics rejoicing in the name, and you'll enjoy this, rejoicing in the name of the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. So when the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights came under pressure from senior management, they revoked this invitation, and it did exemplify another aspect of these episodes, which is the almost comical, misleading quality of the information put out on behalf of the university by its official spokespersons. On this occasion, the university tried to maintain, the episode all became rather embarrassingly public. A certain troublemaker named Professor Stuart Rees was chiefly responsible for this, drawing it to the attention of the ABC 7:30 programme. We in our centre then gave our support to a very vigorous campaign and petition by the Australia-Tibet Council to have the decision reversed. And of course, things came to a screeching halt. But at one point, the university was trying to maintain that the invitation had only been switched to a different time and venue for entirely practical reasons. So it was trying to kind of, wriggle out of the implications of this. And let me just read to you from the statement put out at the time by the Department of Sociology and Social Policy. Because by then it had kind of become almost viral around the university, concern over this episode. It's difficult to be convinced by the statement. What a perfect piece of academese that is, which does not appear to gel with the email correspondence presented in the ABC report, in which the director of the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights writes, "This is to confirm that the decision was taken to withdraw our support for hosting His Holiness the Dalai Lama's planned speech at the university. It will be moved to an off-campus location, and no member of staff or associate of the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights will be involved in organising it." So I had the disorientating experience of sitting in a meeting of the Executive Council of the Sydney Peace Foundation when a member or representative of the management read out this statement, and I held in my hand a piece of paper. I was like Chamberlain. I held in my hand a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper were the very emails refuting the statement that I knew would be the basis of a follow-up report on the ABC 7:30 programme in, 45 minutes. So that was another one, the episode of the Dalai Lama. Yet a third one, and I'll trot through these briefly now. The university organised a human rights conference, an Asia Human Rights Conference in Bangkok. One of the invitees was from the Sri Lankan military, and at the last minute, the Sri Lankan Defence Department said, "We will only come if you withdraw invitations to the Sri Lankan human rights NGOs." So the organisers acceded to that ultimatum, and even told other delegates to go easy on criticising the Sri Lankan government's human rights record from the floor of the meeting. This was at a time when the Rajapaksa government of Sri Lanka was very concerned to try to muzzle criticism in the international community in a doomed effort to stave off a possible independent investigation of war crimes allegations, which indeed eventually took place. So my centre also raised concerns over that, which led to statements being put out dissociating themselves from this conference by the likes of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, which felt it important to make those statements. So, in other words, whenever there has been one of these free speech incidents, somehow our centre has been involved, somehow CPACS has been involved. And also somehow there's been a feeling that the political and/or commercial interests of the university are also somehow in play. Because, of course, at the time of the Human Rights Conference, the Rajapaksa government in Sri Lanka enjoyed the diplomatic support of Australia through the Gillard and Abbott governments as part of a tacit understanding that in return they would stem the flow of asylum seekers heading to Australia. And Australia was seen to have disgraced itself by, for example, using its diplomatic influence in an attempt to sabotage the investigation into these war crimes allegations. Unsuccessful, thankfully. With the Chinese, of course, in spite of the previous Vice-Chancellor Gavin Brown's strictures, there is a feeling that in the episode of the Dalai Lama, it was not entirely coincidental that the Chinese government, which was very exercised on the subject, also pays for a lot of students to come to Sydney and therefore represents quite a substantial portion of the income stream to the university. And then, of course, we come to the case of Israel. Now, Sydney University has a plenitude of links and connections with Israeli higher education. And I'll just mention one instance, which is that there are two matching fellowship schemes, the Technion Fellowship and the Sir Zelman Cowen Fellowship. Now, academic life is full of fellowships, and some are even funded fellowships. And when people fund fellowships, the aim usually is to enhance the excellence of research. And in order to fulfill that aim, they tend to open the field of applications as widely as possible, because you want the best people with the best ideas. How curious it is then that in the case of these fellowship schemes, the pool of potential applicants is restricted only to the staff of these two particular universities. So if you think about it, you know, if the fellowship scheme is going to pay for somebody to have a return flight to Sydney, that's quite a lot of money. If it's going to pay for somebody to live in Sydney for half a year, that really is rather a lot of money. So it's a valuable bauble in academic terms. It may not be quite as luxurious as an all-expenses-paid trip for a journalist, but nonetheless, it's still, you know, by academic standards, quite lavish. So it is really rather odd that it's so restricted, which really does give the game away. Because you see, the aim of those fellowship schemes is not to promote excellence in research. The aim of those fellowship schemes is to exploit the good name of academic research in general, and in these cases, the good name of the University of Sydney in particular, as a way of embedding relations with Israel at so many levels that it becomes unthinkable to make any portion of the relationship between the two countries conditional on a change of behavior. Now, many members of the audience, I'm sure, will know well the manifold ways in which both of those universities, the Technion and the Hebrew University, are embedded and implicated in the occupation and its means. But one of the other aspects of the Technion in particular is that it's host to the Samuel Nieman Institute. And a few years ago, the Samuel Nieman Institute was commissioned by the Israeli Foreign Affairs Ministry to produce the Nieman Report on Public Diplomacy. So it was a research report which recommended lots of ways for Israel to change the subject, to switch the word association. So when people hear the word Israel, they don't think, ah, yes, oppression of the Palestinians, or ah, yes, the occupation. No, they think, ah, yes, what innovative techniques for hydroponic agriculture, or ah, yes, what a fascinating film industry, that kind of thing. And one of its key recommendations was that Israel should cozy up to what it called beneficial clients, and on that list of beneficial clients were institutions of higher education. So Sydney University, by extension, is therefore being used in a sophisticated plan for public diplomacy, or if you will, propaganda or hasbara, in order to try to lessen the pressure from the international community for a change of policy on Israel's part. So in that sense, the famous walls of the sandstone quadrangle of the University of Sydney are coterminous with another much more infamous wall, and they're much closer together than most people at the university would care to admit. Now, for those reasons, therefore, when we in our centre in CPACS adopted our policy of support for the academic boycott, we first wrote to the Vice-Chancellor asking him to revoke those fellowship schemes. He refused, saying it would be inappropriate to boycott a country with which Australia has diplomatic relations, which is an interesting formulation. But at any rate, that was the position we were then in, and our declared support for the boycott meant that when, a little while later, I was asked to endorse an application for one of these fellowships by a Professor Dan Avnon of the Hebrew University, I refused, citing our policy. A short while later, this became the subject of a series of front-page stories in the Australian newspaper. And a short while after that, I found myself in the federal court trying to ward off a lawsuit brought against me by an Israeli NGO called Shurat Hadin, who were trying to maintain that my policy flouted Australia's Racial Discrimination Act. Now, Shurat Hadin, just to digress briefly, was exposed by a fascinating new media project, WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is inconceivable other than in the age of new media. It was exposed by WikiLeaks as having taken orders and received information about whom to target from influential branches of the Israeli state. In other words, it should be seen as an arm's-length attack dog for the Israeli state, trying to interfere with political freedom in other countries. So Happily, you may think, in pre-trial hearings after exhaustive legal argumentation, which didn't come at a very cheap cost, we managed to fend off this allegation because, in common with so many other occasions on which the smear of anti-Semitism is thrown around, the minute it comes into contact with the obligation to provide evidence and sustain logical argument, it tends to melt away. And that's indeed what happened on this occasion. So at the university, there can be no mistaking the fact that we are committed to the academic boycott of Israel. We've had other episodes since in which, again, that smear has been thrown around, including one when a university spokesperson, perhaps the same as the one before, told journalists, for example, that Professor Lynch has been told in the past by senior managers at the university that his views are inappropriate. So that's direct contravention of the provisions on intellectual freedom in the enterprise agreement, for which we exacted due retraction, as you can imagine. Now, the problem is now that this unilateral proposal to downgrade CPACS is kind of swimming around in a sea of similar initiatives. Sometime over the summer, the university management seems to have been bitten by a bug which has caused it to kind of lash out with all these swinging changes which are being pushed through with little or no consultation. So, for example, in a press release sneaked out on Christmas Eve, it was announced that the 160-year-old built-in majority of elected members on the university's governing senate was being abolished. Now it is ever more candidly run by appointed members who were all chosen from the cookie-cutter hard right of the business lobby and put in by the minister to keep us down. We are now trying to rally not only for CPACS, but also for the wider cause of intellectual freedom, and not only for intellectual freedom, but also for the principles of openness and democracy in the conduct of this important public instrumentality, the Australian University. We are at the start of that campaign. Suffice it to say that both mainstream and social media have had to be our allies. Of all the journalists holding the university's spokespersons to account, most of them who do the most effective job do come from the Murdoch press, actually. At the same time, on the other hand, we have the excellence of independent media initiatives, such as New Matilda, for example, to thank for keeping an eye on the opposition that we have managed to rally to this proposal, including from Greens, members of the New South Wales Parliament, and 7 Labour members of the state and federal parliament. So we're at the beginning of the campaign. We will win the campaign, and the way in which we will win the campaign is by reaching out to both mainstream and new media, and by rallying our friends and supporters, because there is a yawning chasm between the corporatized elite of Australia in various of their policy settings, including for universities, and the instincts of the majority of the Australian people. And I'll close on this. We could see that when the infamous budget speech by Joe Hockey, "The age of entitlement is over," except for Joe Hockey, was launched with a multitude of unmandated policy proposals, one of which was the complete deregulation of tuition fees. And so quick were the managements of Australian universities that 31 out of the 32 of them declared their strong support for this initiative, even before, over subsequent days, it turned out that it wouldn't work because a majority of Australians were outraged at the proposition that from now on you will get a degree not based on your ability, but based on your ability to pay. That's how out of touch they are, and that's why we will win.